So this last video, I want to focus on the second version of the categorical imperative, which has to do with respect for persons. Say a little bit about the third version of it at the end, the idea of the kingdom of ends. But on my reading, that third version is much different from the first two. It doesn't really seem to give us an imperative. An imperative should be a guide for action. An imperative should be something that we can consult when we're trying to make an ethical decision. I don't really think the third version is that, at least in the excerpt that we're given from Kant's larger work. But it's definitely worth thinking about because it gives us a kind of a vision of what a moral community should be, and also in an interesting way combines the first and second version of the categorical imperative. But I want to focus on the second version, respect for persons. If we look at the text on page 233, the very bottom of the second column, very bottom of the page, we get the actual formulation of the rule, of the maxim, of the imperative. Act in such a way, it's right here at the bottom, act in such a way that you, sorry for the delay, so act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end and never simply as a means. That is very good advice. And that is the language, the conceptual language of the second version of the categorical imperative really does have to do with ends and means. What would it mean to treat a person as a means rather than an end? What would it mean to violate the second version of the categorical imperative? It would be to treat them as an instrument. To treat them as a means would be to treat them merely as an instrument or a way to get what I want. What would it mean to treat them as an end? I suppose it would mean not to treat them that way. To recognize that they are not to be, I guess, a person is not to be used or exploited. Why not? Okay, well, if we back up to the discussion of this, which really is about what happens on this page of our text. What is the background here? Well, he's thinking about the ground of law. He's thinking about the basis of law. So he's thinking about the basis of obligation. What is it that binds us when it comes to law? Why does law have authority over us? And we could even ask that question. Well, what he says about law is that we recognize that the law has an absolute and intrinsic value. That's why we follow it for its own sake and not for the sake of fear of punishment for not following the law. Right? But what is it that gives the law that intrinsic value? Well, I may be speculating somewhat my interpretation of Kant here, but there must be something in the world which has intrinsic value, something in the world which has absolute value, something in the world where, he says, I have subjective ends. What are subjective ends? Things I want things that I want, and therefore they have value for me. And so they are valuable because I value them. That's why they're subjective ends, in the sense that things become objects of value for me because I want them and desire them, and they have value only because I want them. So it's my want that makes them valuable. If everything in the world were valuable only in this subjective sense, in this conditional sense, that is, the condition is that I value them, then I think Kant would think there'd be no basis for ethics whatsoever, at least his version of ethics. So he asked the question, is there anything which is valuable in itself? Not valuable because I find it valuable. Well, not valuable because I want it. Something which is valuable, something where I would have to acknowledge its value even if I don't want it, even if it doesn't serve any of my desires, any of my needs, any of my projects. Something, therefore, that would be objectively worthy. Not subjectively worthy or a subjective end. Something that would be objectively worthy, an objective end. Worthy in itself. And he thinks that there is. And this is ultimately, I think, the basis for all morality. I mean, as I take Kant personally to mean. That is, that there is something in the world which is objectively worthy, which is intrinsically worthy, and that is a person. If we return to the text, we see that after this discussion on page 233 of whether there are any objective ends as opposed to merely subjective ends, he finds it. He asks, but let us suppose that there were something whose existence has in itself an absolute worth. Something which is an end in itself. Something which as an end in itself could be a ground of determinate laws, like what would be the basis or foundation of moral law. In it and in it alone would there be the ground of a possible categorical imperative, that is, of a practical, of a moral law. So I think there's some basis for saying that the idea of the person as being objectively, intrinsically valuable is kind of the basis of the whole thing. Because he answers this question and says, yes, there is something in the world which is inherently valuable, intrinsically valuable, unconditionally valuable, and that's us. He says, now I say that man, and of course by man he means all of us human beings, and in general every rational being, and that's important, exists as an end in himself and not merely as a means to be arbitrarily used by this or that will. He must, in all his actions, whether directed to himself or to other rational beings, always be regarded at the same time as an end. That is, as an end in the sense of the goal, the purpose. The human being is always that for which something is done, not that by which something is done. The human being is intrinsically valuable. And the human being is intrinsically valuable for Kant because the human being is a rational creature. It's not because of our genetic background. It's not because of our species membership. It's, for Kant, because the human being happens to be a rational being as well. And it's because of that rationality. And that would lead us into a big discussion. What does it mean to be rational? But let's continue a little bit here, which I think is the big distinction. After some, I've pointed out this remark because I think in class it's very important. it leads us into some questions about other living creatures besides human beings and how valuable they are. He says beings whose existence depends not on our will but on nature, and he means animals, have nevertheless, if they are not rational beings, only a relative value as means and are therefore called things. We may very well deny that and believe that animals are not things. I think there are very good reasons for saying that animals are not things, but that is how he regarded it. That is, if you're not a rational being, you're a thing. This may be offensive and in many ways troubling because of cases of human beings not being rational, and that leads to very problematic ideas. And then we would never treat a human being like a thing, even if they weren't rational. So there's something problematic here, but I think there's something valuable as well, and that is the person-thing distinction. And if we put aside the hard cases of animals and human beings who are not fully rational, I think it is a very important distinction. Persons have absolute, intrinsic, objective value. Things have only conditional or subjective value. A thing, let's stick to inanimate objects, things. They can only have value if somebody values them. But persons have intrinsic value. That is, persons are valuable even if no one else values them. This person-thing distinction is, I think, incredibly important. In a certain way, you can think of the second category imperative as saying, never treat a person like a thing. So he goes on to say, on the other hand, rational beings are called persons. So this person-thing distinction is very important in the text. Rational beings are called persons, inasmuch as their nature already marks them out as ends in themselves, that is, as something which is not to be used merely as means, and hence there is imposed thereby a limit, and that limit is imposed on us, on all arbitrary use of such beings, which are thus objects of respect. So that's why I call this version of the categorical imperative respect for persons. That is, the world is filled with beings of different sorts. And the big distinction between the different kinds of beings is persons and things. Things can be used, it's okay. Things can be utilized. Things can be utilized as means to any of my ends, and that's okay. But persons need to be treated with respect. One of the things that's said in the end of the reading, I won't go there, but the beginning of the section on the kingdom of ends says something like this, that the existence of persons limits my freedom of action. How I act with regard to a thing is unlimited. How I act with regard to a person is very limited. I can do whatever I want with things, to things. It's my choice. It has no ethical import, really. But what I do with regard to persons is very much limited. It has limits. It has boundaries that I cannot cross. And it's full of ethical import. So this huge distinction, this hugely important distinction between persons and things, I would say, for my personal reading over the years and thinking about Kantianism and trying to employ it in my life, that this is probably the central, most important distinction between things and persons. It leads to all sorts of important ideas about rights, about our duties and responsibilities to each other, about how we live our lives. But if we return to the original thing, he says, if then there is, this is the bottom of page 233, to be a supreme practical principle, and as far as the human will is concerned, a categorical imperative, then it must be such that from the conception of what is necessarily an end for everyone, because this end is an end in itself, it constitutes an objective principle of the will and can hence serve as a practical law. That is, something that everyone recognizes to be objectively valuable. The ground of such a principle is this: rational nature exists as an end in itself. In this way, man necessarily thinks of his own existence, that is, we all value ourselves. And thus far, it is a subjective principle of human actions. But in this way, also does every other rational being think of his existence on the same rational ground that holds also for me. Hence, it is at the same time an objective principle. That is, I value myself. Why do I value myself? Well, here we get back to the notion of rationality. I am aware of myself. I am self-conscious. I can not only live my life, I can think about living my life. I can think about how I should live my life. That's part of being rational. I'd say it's the essence of being rational. And it might be what divides us from non-human living things, ultimately. And it may be that that's the key question. If other animals can think about themselves and think about how they live their lives, then they're probably rational, and we shouldn't eat them or enslave them or make them into food and clothing and things like that. So that's a big question. And believe me, it's a question that contemporary ethical theorists, contemporary moral philosophers do engage in. But it's my awareness of myself, it's my ability to think about myself and my life, and therefore to take responsibility for my actions, which is tied up with this idea of valuing myself. I don't just value myself because of my desires. I value myself because I recognize the kind of creature I am. And if my valuing myself depends upon the kind of creature I am, then I have to admit that there are others just like me who value themselves because of the kind of creatures they are. And therefore, I can't stop at valuing myself. I must value others. And not because they do anything for me or represent any kind of means to the achievement of my own happiness, but just because of the kind of beings that they are. But in this way, does every other rational being think of his existence on the same rational ground that also holds for me. Hence, it is at the same time an objective principle, not a subjective one, an objective one, from which, as a supreme practical ground, all laws of the will must be able to be derived. So it really is the basis. The practical imperative will therefore be the following: act in such a way, and here we return to it, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time, as an end and never simply as a means. So that's the second version. And if we look to what he calls the third formulation of the categorical imperative, we get some very interesting commentary or elucidation of the second one here in the beginning, where he says that this principle of humanity and of every rational nature generally as an end in itself is the supreme limiting condition of every man's freedom of action. My freedom of action, because of the existence of persons, my freedom of action is limited. There are limits to what I can do because I can never use a person as a means. I must always acknowledge their personhood and treat them as intrinsically valuable. Now, the third version of the categorical imperative, the idea of the kingdom of ends, is really, I would say, different in nature. And as we said in class, really has to do with really, you might say, the combining of two, the two main ideas of the first and second version of the categorical imperatives, the idea of universalizability and the idea of respect for persons. Because the idea is in the kingdom of ends that the universal law that I will, let's say in the first version of the categorical imperative, is one that I impose upon myself. I mean, that's the key to it here. As I said, this is basically an idea that he's borrowing from Rousseau, from the social contract. Rousseau had this idea of the state, where the state is composed of the general will. All of us give over our individual wills and create a general will, so that everything that the state legislates is really just a representation of all of those individual wills. So an individual is really legislating for him or herself under a representative government. I think Kant is adopting that idea and saying that when we make moral decisions, what we're really doing is legislating universal law for ourselves. It's really the principle of freedom. It doesn't really stand as a, I'm sorry, I saw the word stand there. It's not really a guide to action. It's more of a characterization of what it means to be a moral creature. He says here, a rational being belongs to the kingdom of ends. A rational being belongs to the kingdom of ends as a member when he legislates in it universal laws, while also being himself subject to these laws. He belongs to it as sovereign, as lawmaker, when as legislator he is himself subject to the will of no other. The kingdom of ends would be kind of a utopian situation where we realized that all of us have intrinsic value and need to be respected, and that also all of us are free. That when we obey moral law, we obey it finally because we recognize it for ourselves and as being valid and give it to ourselves. It's maybe not a utopian idea so much as a recognition of what morality itself is, which is a rational creature is free, but a rational creature is also one who conforms to moral law. This makes that conformity to moral law compatible with that freedom. It's just something that I think is really beautiful and important. It may not be as useful, really, as the first and second version of the categorical imperative, because it doesn't really, it's a vision of what it means to be a moral creature rather than any kind of rule that we could follow that would help us make decisions.